but certainly not least in our series on broken glass. In the last segment, we've been featuring colleagues who are working out of AUB, whether in the history of science and contributions on the coloring of glass, or in terms of the continuum mechanics of glass, with last week's lecture on the structural properties of glass, fracture in particular. And today it is my great pleasure to welcome a colleague and a dear friend and an interlocutor, Professor Nadia Abu Ali, who is an assistant professor at the AUB's Civilization Study Program and its current director. So in thinking about this series and thinking about glass, I've had many conversations with Nadia, and it is in the context of these conversations that the elements of her contributions today, which have continued evolving ever since that conversation, started coming together. So I'm personally very much looking forward to this conclusive statement by Nadia, and I believe it will be one that will also put the whole series in context in the ways that perhaps only Nadia can do. So I'm very excited about having her conclude the series, and I've managed to put a lot of pressure on her, which I'm sure she will handle with great humor. And in asking her about having someone moderate for her, she suggested Rohit Goel. And I've come to know of Rohit from Nadia through their collaboration around BICAR, which stands for the Bombay Beirut Institute for Critical Analysis and Research. I'm personally quite excited about the work of this institute and try to follow their activities in town, which have made for very interesting opening to some very difficult issues, and often for someone like me, somewhat difficult to follow, but I keep trying. So without further ado, I will turn the floor now to Rohit, who will introduce Nadia and then allow us to kick this beautiful episode off. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jihad. And thank you all for coming. Thanks especially to Nadia for asking me to moderate this. It's always really special when I get to do things with Nadia, because beyond being sort of a very, very old friend and colleague, she's more like a sister and comrade to me. So it's always super special to do anything with Nadia. So thank you both, Jihad and Nadia, for suggesting me for this. As Jihad said, Nadia is extraordinarily accomplished. She's an assistant professor currently at the American University of Beirut and the director of civilizational studies. She researches, her interests in research are intellectual history, psychoanalysis, of course, which several of you know, critical theory as well. The two of us had the pleasure of editing a book that was based off of a conference that Nadia, of course, organized through the Beirut Institute for Critical Analysis and Research, and AUB, called Lacan contra Foucault, came out with Bloomsbury in 2019. And she's also published her own manuscript, a tremendous feat, called Psychoanalysis and the Love of Arabic, through Edinburgh University Press in 2020. Nadia and I came together to start, a wild idea called BICAR in, I think it was Nadia, I guess it was 2014, 15 in Beirut when I was living there. And, it was a very much, as, Lacan would put it, a para academic space, in the sense that it was not like explicitly trying to criticize establishment, institutional university discourses, knowledge acquisition, nor was it trying to reproduce those things. It was just trying to exist alongside of establishment institutions. And we came up with the labor of intellectual love through Bicard, so much so that we founded Bicard in Bombay 2 years ago and are doing a tremendous amount of pedagogy here. And given the situation in Beirut, things have had to be a bit on pause with Bicard in Beirut, but we'll pick up hopefully soon. I don't want to take much time away from Nadia, but I just wanted to do some housekeeping stuff. So when Nadia is finished with what promises to be a very stimulating talk, the way that I think we should do question and answer. It's always nice if you would use the raise hand function, right? If you know how to do that. I'm a Luddite, so I hardly know how to use these functionalities myself. But if you don't know how to do that, just type in the chat box. I have a question, and I will keep a queue, whether you've raised your hand or whether you've typed in the chat box, and then I will call on you to hopefully unmute yourself to ask Nadia directly your questions about her talk, or I can read them out if you have internet issues or if you'd prefer to stay muted. So that's about what I have to say for housekeeping. And without further ado, I think we go into Nadia's talk. So please, Nadia.
All right. I will start my shares. Okay, so I want to, of course, thank Jihad and Rohit for all their words, and I hope this is in the least not disappointing, Jihad, for all the build-up that you've kind of set ahead of me for this. But so I'll just kind of jump straight into it. So the question that I want to begin with, or start with, is what are we really talking about in a series of talks that Jihad has curated? Are we talking about glass as a material, or glass as a portal, a door to discuss other matters, a material that somehow matters? Or in other words, the question I'm beginning with is, why does glass even matter? After listening to the series of talks presented by a number of colleagues, many of them as I could, we could perhaps say that the investigation of a class is not so transparent after all. For are we investigating a material or a medium? Is glass both? But so would then be many other things that wouldn't really distinguish glass from many other things. Is there something about glass, in the heart of glass, that demands attention, as Jihad has kind of called upon us to pay attention to glass? Perhaps there is nothing in glass itself, nothing that is besides complex chemical and physical reactions involved in its making, which we've heard about in some of our talks. Processes that are historically, as our archaeologists and historians have shown, require an amalgam of forces for them to be possible, from pharaohs to kings to consolidations of power, wealth, market dynamics, orientalist oversights, and large architectural projects that require perhaps all the above. Perhaps Jihad came to this project in the aftermath of the Beirut port explosion, the shattered glass everywhere, on the streets of the city, kilometers of glass in the large kilometer range of the explosion. Not only there, but also in the bodies of those affected. Some individuals continue to remove glass shards from their bodies to this day. Glass travels in mysterious ways inside the human body. It's very hard to trace and extract. Sometimes the body expels it, and at others it doesn't. The cue then for this investigation may be the shattered glass in the city, perhaps, and the realization induced by it, the realization that the city, Beirut, especially the reconstructed district of downtown Beirut, the Solidaire region formerly, is mostly made of glass. A realization that many have felt in their bodies. But then what does this say about the city, about the present that we are in? the transposition of glass into human bodies as a result of absolute non-transparency in government, the glass in the streets, our shattered images and broken glass. Perhaps these are the blind spots of our investigation into glass. So I'm going to try in the talk to employ a blind spot mirror in what follows to make sure that the blind spot is brought into vision. If you're driving, eliminating a blind spot is crucial to avoid any accidents. But if we are talking, as we are here, a blind spot may perhaps be the springboard for a series of connections that may appear contingent, that through retroaction can perhaps come together. So my talk will then be an exercise in retroactive reflection, a blind spot mirror to thinking of glass and what makes sense about it and what doesn't. And accordingly, the talk will be divided into two large parts. Not too large, I won't speak for long, but two sections. The glass city is part one, and the glass body is part two. I would like to begin with a discussion of Frederick Jameson's analysis of the famous Westin Bonaventure Hotel in LA. Jameson takes the Bonaventure, which is distinctly enveloped in an entire glass facade, and also contains a revolving restaurant at the top, to represent postmodern architecture. Postmodern architecture for Jameson is distinctly populist and characterized by the effacement of distinctions between high and low culture, as in how postmodern architecture posits itself as a critique of high modernism, of high modernist architecture. So what distinguishes postmodernism, according to Jameson, is not a style or an aesthetic form, but as he says, and I quote, a cultural dominant, a conception which allows for the presence and coexistence of a range of very different yet subordinate features, end of quote. So the pastiche, the kitsch, the multinational, the heterogeneous, the hybrid, coexistence of distinct forces whose effectivity is undecidable. These are the terms within which kind of Jameson discusses the Bonaventure Hotel and makes his posits his analysis of postmodern architecture. The Bonaventure as a space carries all these implications. It is a popular building visited by all kinds of people. Its entrances are mostly from very strange places. You get lost in the space, as many have recounted. The sixth floor, the backways, these are entry points. Upon entry, there are multiple escalators, multiple elevators in the building, in the interior. Its entrances appear to be determined by its internal space, or as Jameson puts it, the Bonaventura aspires to being a total space. There's no clear distinction between its inside and its outside. A complete world, a kind of a miniature city. And Jameson says, and I would want to add to this new total space corresponds a new collective practice, a new mode in which individuals move and congregate, something like the practice of a new and historically original kind of hypercrowd, end of quote. On his account, the Bonaventura does not wish to be part of the city, but to replace the city, to come into its place, to substitute it, to become a city within a city, a populism in the polis. The difference between the disjunction between postmodern architecture and high modernist ones is that the latter, the modernist architecture, for example, this is an example of the Oscar Niemeyer site, well, not very far from here in Tripoli. It's a discontinued modernist, high modernist project. And the difference between such high modernist projects and postmodern architecture was that the latter, the modernist projects, were quite violent. They were disruptive, distinctly different from the city, what one would call utopian spaces where the city was meant to somehow renegotiate itself. Modernism had style. It had late style, as Adorno and Edward Said would call it. While postmodernism is not about style, as Jameson discusses, but about a cultural dominant. that is constituted through the coexistence of a range of very different yet subordinate features. One glass city after the other replicate. Dubai, Beirut, Qatar, New York, etc., glass skyscrapers, environmental hazards. We can venture to say that the glass age, if there is one, probably began with the Crystal Palace exhibition building in 1751, designed by John Paxton. And this is kind of my kind of really wild jump here, a jump from John Paxton's Crystal Palace exhibition in 1751 to J.G. Ballard's novel, The Crystal World, which I will use as in relationship to Jameson's discussion of postmodern architecture and the glass facade of the Bonaventure. It's very interesting that you have these two. I'm going to kind of juxtapose Jameson's analysis of postmodern architecture through the Bonaventure Hotel with Ballard's dystopia, right? Ballard's brilliant novel, another one of his dystopic novels, The Crystal World, where something very interesting happens. The end of the world is depicted by Ballard as a moment within which complete crystallization happens. Begins in the forests and ends up in living bodies. The bodies become crystal in this novel, become glass. So if we can venture to say that the glass age began with the Crystal Palace exhibition building, it may have always already ended in J.G. Ballard's Crystal World. A petrified world that Ballard depicts in this novel, in which crystallization is the only thing that happens. Particles of anti-time colliding with particles of time, everything being turned slowly into quartz, crystallized frozen time. In Ballard's Crystal World, which is a great source for thinking about our postmodern glass age, as I'm proposing, the human body itself becomes glass, becomes crystallized. Blind animals with glass eyes, men lurching out of the ground with crystal legs planted into the ground. The human body, as Ballard describes it, effloresces into crystals. The body becomes a mirror of itself. Through the crystal structures that form from within it, you see in Ballard's depictions reflected the body's outlines, a finger and a hand, through dozens of multicolored reflections that occur because of this process of crystallization. Could Jameson's Bonaventure be an allegory of Ballard's post-apocalyptic world? So the game here is, could the postmodern reality within which we're in be in itself an allegory of Ballard's post-apocalyptic world, dystopic world? A time in which there's no particles of time, where time collides with anti-time, empty homogeneous time, where structure itself becomes crystallized, set in glass. Is the postmodern condition already in itself a nostalgia for a time when there was no time? When there was no outside to the crystal world, when we were made of glass? Postmodern architecture with its great glass facades just sits there, content with the unraveling of the city's fabric, not desiring anything that is other or different, but only desiring itself. As Jameson describes it, the reflective glass skin of the Bonaventure, the glass skin repels the city outside, a repulsion for which we have analogies in those reflector sunglasses, which make it impossible for your interlocutor to see your own eyes and thereby achieve a certain aggressivity to words and power over the other. In a similar way, the glass skin achieves a peculiar and placeless dissociation of the Bonaventure from its neighborhood. It is not even an exterior, inasmuch as when you seek to look at the hotel's outer walls, you cannot see the hotel itself, but only the distorted images of everything that surrounds it. This was from Jameson's description of the Bonaventure. The great reflexive skin of the Bonaventure not only reproduces what is, but also aggressively transmits a gaze, as Jameson depicts it, that cannot be returned, like these reflective glasses that people wear all the time. Like other glass edifices, I mean, the Bonaventure, like other glass edifices, entraps you in its gaze, like a big glass eye in the middle of the city. This gaze or dissociating look of glass skin and glass surface is something that I want to now discuss. And here I will draw, of course, on psychoanalysis. So what lies in the crystalline gaze of glass, or of this postmodern glass structures, postmodern glass body, if not death? We know this since Medusa's myth and Narcissus's fated glance into the lake. In psychoanalysis, primary narcissism is a fundamental condition of identification for the speaking animal, who must always pass through a moment in which self-consciousness is negated by its own image. The image of the self captures an I, ossifies the ego as an inert, mute object, weaves it into a chain of signification, into language, while leaving much more to be desired for the subject. Identification thrusts the subject into a dialectic of desire, a desire that is more often than not the desire of an other. Now, if we go back to the crystallized forest of Port Royal in Ballard's novel, we can see how the passage of time inevitably for Ballard leads to death. If time is linked to motion, all motion inevitably leads to death, with time as its servant. From the crystal forests to the double galaxy in Andromeda, there is time and there is anti-time. I quote from Ballard. Just as a supersaturated solution will discharge itself into a crystalline mass, so the supersaturation of matter in our continuum leads to its appearance in a parallel spatial matrix. As more and more time leaks away, the process of supersaturation continues. The original atoms and molecules producing spatial replicas of themselves, substance without mass, in an attempt to increase their foothold upon existence. The process is theoretically without end, and it may be possible eventually for a single atom to produce an infinite number of duplicates of itself, and so fill the entire universe from which simultaneously all time has expired. An ultimate macrocosmic zero beyond the wildest dreams of Plato and Democritus. This was an excerpt from Ballard's description of the process unfolding in the crystal world. So a lot hinges on the description of the movement of time and progress that Ballard provides, that Bonaventure stands for, in terms of vitrification, of an inescapable crystallization, of a series of mirrors and entrapments. Incidentally, something I've been interested in for a long time, the topic of my first book. Again, a quote from Ballard. The air in the house was cold and motionless, but as the storm subsided, moving away across the forest, the process of vitrification seemed to diminish. Everything in the high-ceilinged room had been transformed by the frost. Several plate glass windows appeared to have been fractured and infused together above the carpet, and the ornate Persian patterns swam below the surface like the floor of some perfumed pool in the Arabian Nights. All the furniture was covered by the same glacé sheath. The arms and the legs of the straight-backed chairs against the walls embellished by exquisite curlicues and helixes. The imitation Louis XV pieces had been transformed into huge fragments of opalescent candy, whose multiple reflections glowed like giant chimeras in the cut glass walls. This is again a description of the crystal world from Ballard. So we can perhaps say by now that glass is age old, as the archaeologists and the historians have argued. It is both age old and ageless. After all, the age-old silences of jeweled skies, of distant stars and galaxies, is somehow always looking at us from another time, telling us that we will be here for some time. We will be here for enough time to have one déjà vu after the other, to be in the hall of mirrors from which we are made. So how can we think through this metaphor of the body as glass? What would it mean to consider the body as a crystal mirror that has no nominal interiority? What is a glass body if not a disruption of the strict separation between the inside and the outside, the Umwelt and the Innenwelt, to borrow from Freud? Ballard's crystallized bodies thrust out of a crystal landscape, like artworks. They are molds of a life that was there before and which has been frozen into an eternal time. The glass bodies in Ballard's novel crystallize the spatial relation between what is inside and outside. The body becomes a reflective surface, and a continuum is established between the subject and the object in a way that comes to replace all that is inside. A heterogeneous exteriority, an uncanny double of the body emerges in the glass body or in the crystal body. In medicine, the glass body is a pathological condition. It's called the demi-lune body. It's a degenerated red blood cell that is swollen by imbibition. It emerges post a very strong infection, like malaria or typhoid. A memory cell of sickness is a glass cell, a degenerated red blood cell. A memory cell of a sickness that leaves traces in the human body. Ballard's glass bodies in the crystal world are not too far away from this medicinal account of pathological cells, but they also invoke a psychoanalytic account of an uncanny double, of an uncanny doubling. Glass takes over the human body because of an unknown disease, an affliction, and the dystopia that Ballard draws, one that Jameson names the postmodern architectural bodies taking over all our cities. So glass takes over the human body because of an unknown disease that spreads from the Black Forest. It is a dark force in Ballard's novel that paralyzes the body and petrifies it through crystallization. From a denatured nature to the body as an extimate thing, this word that Lacan comes up with to break any distinction between interiority and exteriority, the extimate thing, the most innermost foreign thing, the glass extension of the body, the way that Ballard depicts the refracted images of the body coming out of itself in its sheaths of vitrification and crystallization. So glass takes over the human body because of this unknown disease that spreads from the Black Forest. It is a dark force that paralyzes the body and petrifies it through crystallization. From a denatured nature to the body as this extimate thing, neither inside nor outside, a site of a non-relation between nature and culture, formed by the drives, by a compulsion that nobody knows where it comes from in Ballard's novel. So if we're to push this metaphor even further, the bodies of glass are bodies of glass reflecting the cities of glass. The Bonaventura-like structures in all our cities gradually infecting the human body with a glass virus, a crystal ecology of postmodernism. In Ballard's novel, the crystal world stands for a dark force that eliminates the simple distinction between the normal and the pathological. The crystal world is a phantasmagoria, a frozen image of the future that is embedded into our present, a mute and deaf star, which is always already a dead future to come. We are, after all, made from stardust, as we are told. The glass body in Ballard's crystal world becomes an avatar of the crystal forest. The crystallization of human bodies is a final note in the dystopia that Ballard creates. The main character starts to encounter everywhere uncanny crystallized bodies, crystal limbs, efflorescent creatures. His own wife is transubstantiated, but into glass. the substance of flesh becomes glass. So what is so horrible, in a sense? Why is it a dystopia? What is so horrible about the body becoming glass? Or stated otherwise, why would Ballard depict the horror of the end of the world in terms of the body becoming glass? Ballard's Freudian influences are not a secret. In writing science fiction, he himself claimed that his literature responded to one particular science, psychoanalysis, which is a field whose status as a science is quite contested and complicated, to say the least. However, Ballard maintained an intellectual allegiance to Freud to the very end of his writing career. In Miracles of Life, he states that, "I felt strongly, and I still do, that psychoanalysis and surrealism were a key to the truth about existence and the human personality, and also a key to myself," as Ballard. So the debate about psychoanalysis and science is perhaps not so tangential here for the purposes of the talk, but there is no room to get into this. However, Ballard's experimental fiction in the 60s and the 70s played around the fusion of psychoanalysis with the mathematical sciences. I will settle here for the more obvious connection between psychoanalysis and literature. The main argument that psychoanalysis claims is that the I is always inhabited by an other. The ego, the I, is always a stranger in its own house. The discontinuities in consciousness, the dreams, the jokes, the slips of tongues, or the so-called dregs of human phenomena that Freud insisted on investigating, or the relationship between sense and nonsense, reason and its irrational obverse side, can be encapsulated in Freud's notion of the uncanny, of the unheimlich. Freud records an experience that he had on a train while coming out of the washroom. He mistakes his own reflection in the glass stain for an other, and he has a jolt. He has this. He jumps at the moment he recognized that it was actually him in the glass pane. And from there, Freud goes to write the text, his famous text from 1919, The Uncanny. So in a sense, there's nothing quite like glass when it comes to reflecting on the uncanny, particularly on the metaphor of reflection for the identification of the subject in the world. The uncanny, or the unheimlich, which Freud developed through a reading of E.T. Hoffman's Sandman, is characterized in Freud's telling that the Sandman, who Freud takes to be, the Sandman, which is a folktale that children were told of the man who comes and steals children's eyes when they do not sleep and feeds them to his own children. And as folktales went in the 19th century. So the uncanny, or the unheimlich, which Freud writes this text and develops it through a particular reading of E.T. Hoffman's Sandman, is very, is linked to the way that the Sandman is depicted or characterized as an inhuman, doll-like thing, a thing that is characterized by an automaticity, an inanimate object that acts as though it is animate and generates a sense of dread, a bit also like the image that Freud catches of himself in the mirror. So the figure of the Sandman in Hoffman's tales robs one of their own eyes through a process of doubling. The Sandman doubles the law. So of course, Freud does it, does a very close reading of the story of the main figure Nathaniel, who at the loss of his father, who was visited by a friend who Nathaniel convinces himself is the Sandman, who happens to be there at the moment of the father's death, and Nathaniel develops this kind of fear of the Sandman, who seems to appear at every moment in the story that Nathaniel falls in love, or tries to fall in love, or identify himself in an other, or through an other. And Freud has a very long reading of this, but the figure of the Sandman in the tale is understood by Freud. Ultimately, the analysis of the story is that the sense of the uncanny or the unheimlich is related to what Freud calls a kind of a castration anxiety, an anxiety from the law, from authority, from the parental figure, from the father. So the Sandman in Freud's reading doubles the law, doubles authority. He comes this figure to, his uncanniness is linked to the fact that he comes in the place of the law, authority, the father, the self in another person, an other. So this doubling is very intriguing, and this is this process of doubling that Freud captures, which of course is not very far away from any metaphor or of reflection that we can think about, is very far from the pre-modern model of the doubling of the mortal body by an immortal soul. Freud argues that the uncanny double in modernity, the gaze, the reflection, the other, the desire of the other, is a harbinger of death and not immortality, of a drive, a compulsion that we do not know why it works in that way. We can always, so as not to kind of get mired in the details of the Sandman story, which Freud constructs from his account of the uncanny, we can also revert to perhaps simpler or earlier instances of representation in human, myths and human history with regards to the medium of that we are discussing. The glass eyes of Medusa, for example, strike us with a chilling ability to fracture any image. Freud also dwelled on Medusa's gaze, the cold glass eyes that reflect back an image of the self that is so unbearable, so uncanny, that it reflects a wish for complete petrification. You become stone. You almost vitrify, but into stone in before our glass age, our postmodern glass age. So what happens in Medusa's gaze is a destruction of representation. Lacan, following Freud, formulated his theory of subjectivity based on what he called the mirror stage in the formation of the I. For Lacan, the mirror image is a metaphor of desire and its unattainable object cause. So the moment that the self reflects or sees its reflect is captured by an image, lured or captured by an image in the mirror. The subject is thrown into this dialectic of desire. That is me, but that is also not me. There's something else. There's something more. So this is what does the other desire of me, and so on. So glass then, or these metaphors of reflection, not only signal a problem of representation, but also raise questions of causality. The psychoanalytic engagement with reflection essentially argues, and this is where, I'm saying this could be perhaps a third moment. So from the glass age to the glass body to the psychoanalytic account of reflection and subjectivity, the psychoanalytic engagement with reflection essentially argues that the ancient model of representation in the looking glass appears to be looped into a structure of repetition in our contemporary world. Glass capitalism, if there is such a thing. Transparent egos of free communication, transparent houses, abodes, seeking the gaze at any cost, preferably at no cost beyond the fractures of irreparable plates. The inside and outside can no longer be easily distinguished. There's this miring, which glass, I think as a medium, as a material, opens up for us to think. Ballard's dystopia, in a sense, may already be our postmodern future past. When all is done and over, glass will be strewn everywhere under the rays of the sun, reflecting all the destruction. We can say then that, in a sense, my talk did not really address glass as a medium, but rather questioned the very idea of a medium that transposes an immediacy beyond a mediation, beyond the mediation of the historical, subjective, social, cyclical, and so on. So the looking glass is then perhaps not a site for finding anything that exists. If we take the psychoanalytic account seriously, if we take Ballard's dystopia seriously and Jameson's account seriously. We can say that in the looking glass, there is nothing but a horrifying other. The postmodern glass city, like our postmodern subjectivities, is decentered, easily fragmented, leaving one in a sense of loss, a loss of direction. With glass, it seems we cannot escape getting mired in the problematics of sense and nonsense. Glass is not about what is and isn't, or an investigation of glass is not about what is and isn't. Rather, it appears to be a medium that flags a limit, a cut, a breaking point for testing reality and how we come to know it. All right, that's kind of what I have for this talk. So yeah, I'm going to stop here. Hello?
I'm assuming that Rohit can unmute himself and talk. I'm not sure. Thank you very much, Nadia. That was amazing.
Am I audible or Jihad?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, but shall I put my video on, or is the connection going to suffer from too many videos being on? I'm happy.
Let's try and see how it goes. I will certainly switch my video off.
Okay, 1 second. So let me just. I'm operating with this new iMac, so I don't know how to. Okay, there we go. Start my video. Allow. Am I visible? Audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nadia. That was great. Really thoughtful and like a tremendous amount to unpack. And I think that probably a lot of the participants here, you want, sort of want to ask questions. I wanted to just like sort of start off the discussion, which I'm sure will be very robust, with just a couple of questions on glass. Right? So the first question has to do with the Bonaventure Hotel, okay, which was like a great reading, and I think it's a perfect reading, and I love teaching the Bonaventure Hotel, and I think Ballade was fantastic. You know, I mean, I don't read Ballade, and that was really illuminating. You know, to hear you talk about Ballade around like in relationship to the Bonaventure Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, right? So it's a postmodern nightmare, right? The Bonaventure Hotel. It's a postmodern nightmare. I think precisely from what you were saying about the Hall of Mirrors, about the glass, you just can't help but feel lost, right? In postmodernism, right? You're actually searching for authority. Like, you're actually trying to, like, I've been inside of the hotel as well. You know, Jameson talks about this in the book. Like, you can't even find your room. Like, but everything, as you said, is transparent. It's translucent. Like, even the elevator shafts in that hotel are translucent. You know, everything is open, right? And so visibility, right, is absolutely, you know, presented through, you know, the glass edifices of the entire hotel, but it's a visibility in loss that cultivates loss, right? And so I was hoping that you could, my first question, I guess, is just if you could talk about the relationship between seeing in loss, right? Actually just being able to see something, right? And you touched upon this with the mirror stage, I think, you know, like you're alienated in another's image through seeing yourself in the mirror, or seeing yourself in another person, right? That's how you form an ego, or you're the unity of yourself. But this idea of vision, of the relationship between vision, like clarity and loss, right, and obscurity, that I think is really, really pointed in your entire talk about glass, right? Is that there's always a double-edged sword to glass. What appears to be translucent is actually what appears most to be translucent, to be clearest, is actually the most obscurantist, right, in a certain sense. So if you can touch upon that relationship, and maybe speculatively venture upon a notion of wisdom that I think, you're so interested in psychoanalysis, that I think psychoanalysis would really like, of course, you know, which is King Oedipus, right? Who had to, in his very blindness, right? So not being able to see in that translucence that is glass, that is mirrors, that is etc., right? And not being able to see, had to appeal to shepherds and slaves, right? To construct what has happened, right? He actually couldn't appeal to the elites around him in his court, because if anything, they were going to be the obscurantists that precisely glass is, right? So there's this, if you could just start us off by talking about the potential progressiveness, and this will come to the last point that I want to make, of shattering glass, right? The potential progressiveness of the shattering of glass, as we saw, and you put it very pointedly in the example of Beirut. That glass did not shatter; it disseminated like lots of objets, like lots of into the bodies of people. It didn't shatter. There was no glass that shattered, as the typical depictions of the blast, you know, sort of recounted. That glass landed somewhere, you know, and in our bodies, right? Which I think is a very important point. It wasn't the shattering of glass that took place, right? It was the dissemination of glass that bombing, you know, sort of put forth. But so, if you can talk about the potential progressiveness of deglassifying, right, of blindness, and if you can link that maybe especially to the sort of tangible situation of Beirut after the horrendous non-shattering of the glass, just the glass finding new homes inside of us, that took place. That's how I wanted to start the discussion. Then we can open it up. And again, just to say, for housekeeping, please raise hands. I'll keep the queue, and or type your questions in the chat box, and I can read them out. So thank you so much for a really thoughtful talk.
Yeah, no, thanks also for your generous reading of my attempt to answer, you know, to this question that Jihad raised in this invitation. And you know, I think let me see how to kind of maybe to start with an answer to your question by, you know, how do you say, an account of blindness that could be somewhat progressive, right? So if we and via Oedipus in particular, perhaps, if we want to do that, and then, well,
just the obvious example.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious example. No, obviously, because I mean, with Oedipus, you know, and Oedipus at Colonus, you know, the chorus says, say you are guilty, say you are guilty, you have killed your father and married or slept with your mother, right? Like, say you are guilty. Why is Oedipus considered, especially by Lacan, more so than by Freud as such, but as a kind of in a position of, in a heroic position, right? Because Oedipus, he's being abjured, he's being told, now you must kill yourself, right? Of course, you must pay for what you have done. You must end as Oedipus. You must be finished. What a calamity, right? And the act that Oedipus carries out, and its particular kind of symbolic function is that he blinds himself, right? He literally gorges his eyes out, right? The famous images of Oedipus plucking out his eyes. And what's so intriguing about this moment is that by doing this, right, it's as though Oedipus is saying, before I could see, but I was blind, right? Now I am blind, but I can finally see, right? So almost in a sense, accepting his condition of blindness is fundamental. That's the only thing he's willing to accept, right? He had not known all this. This is an unconscious mechanism that he was wrapped into. Desire of an other that he
this
had
comes up in
right.
And this is interesting. This comes up in Isaiah, right? I mean, from the book, God gave us eyes so we could not see.
But the Oedipus situation is, I mean, what Oedipus does in precise sense is that he's willing to, or how does one say, he no longer disavows his blindness, right? He no longer, which I suppose in a sense, the question you're asking about Beirut or about what happened is that in a sense, even the explosion, even the disaster, even the shattering, right, of the glass that shattered, even that has somehow not succeeded in changing.
Well, it just disseminated vision. It's like it was like disseminated mirrors almost, right? As opposed to shattered mirrors.
I like this. I mean, I completely agree, right? One could say that, not to kind of do the boring invocation of an Oedipal, the Oedipal problem, but one can say a lot about the setup we're in, and political identifications and sectarianism and communal, setups. But yes, I mean, I would agree with what you're saying, that the breaking of glass or the broken glass everywhere has not really shattered the conditions of vision, of sight that we are locked into. The dream of the good life has shattered, but not the fantasy of the good life itself. It's still a frame. We want it back, or
it's been disseminated even further and deeper. It's like little pocket mirrors that have gone to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually, it's actually a great commentary, a great addition that you're doing. It's kind of like actually tying in properly my two kind of fragmented sections, right? This, the postmodern, the spatial logic of postmodernity, the way that it spatially works, right? Of course, and almost kind of the move into the body, right? Perhaps Jameson's narrative for that would be the cognitive mapping that you're stuck into, the exit, right? But from a kind of a, from the detour I took by psychoanalysis is, yes, I mean, in the sense that how does one really shatter the fantasy frame without the false sense of, without the uncanny, the anxiety, right? Anxiety becomes the only affect possible besides really traversing or getting over, or kind of working through the fantasies that delimit.
Correct. And that leads me to like my second and final question before we open it up, which is precisely on this issue of anxiety. And I say this with utter precaution, because I mean anxiety in a very strictly clinical sense of anxiety, not in terms of the the horror or the terror that we feel when there's an explosion that's taking place in front of us, or glass coming at us, and damaged friends of ours, and awful. Right. So what I mean by anxiety is precisely clinical, and in some ways, I feel like what the Beirut blast, with its dissemination of compact mirrors through the shattered glass, if we can extend the metaphor, right, to, what was it, a 40-kilometer radius or something like that, or
I don't know, probably, but yeah, somewhere around that. Yeah.
The Dahlia makeup artist must have been upset about that, but I mean, free compacts, right? I mean, but what I mean is that, which was absolutely horrific and terrible, but it really puts paid to the truth of the fact that anxiety is not something that we can generate out of experience with something, right? Like a bombing, or a trauma is something that is outside of experience. So again, we often use language of anxiety or trauma with regards to bomb blasts here in India, constant thuggishness and destruction of mosques and lynchings by the central Hindu right. But by not saying that these are not traumatic events, or these are not anxiety-inducing events, I don't mean to say that they're not horrible, of course. So I want that to be clear. But just like the blast in Beirut, the port blast was absolutely horrible. But it suggests that the anxiety that actually is required to shatter glass, right, cannot come from within the realm of historical badness or experience. A bomb blast, government neglect, fascism, et cetera, et cetera. Anxiety requires work, analytical work, to cultivate in someone, right? And so to break out of, to borrow from the partial title of your first book, and just from what you've been saying in your talk, or what you've just said in your talk, to break out of the hall of mirrors, to shatter the glass of narcissistic identification, considering experience as anxiety-inducing or traumatic, is not correct, right? We, like, what was required after something like the bomb blast or a lynching on the streets of Bombay, of a so-called untouchable, is a work to get someone, like an analytical work, to get someone to feel anxious about the fact that had happened. It's not something that's automatic. So if you can talk a bit about that work of shattering glass that is required to induce anxiety, and hence, introduce the possibility of resubjectivizing in a non-fascistic, in a non-complacent, in a non-lethargic way, that would be great. And then I can see that there are already some questions coming up, so we'll turn to them.
Yeah, thanks, Rohit. I mean, well, this is a complicated question, because it's almost a question of, it's a general question of how to put a psychoanalytic working through to work politically. It's a really, it's a big question, right? And
Yes.
one can say a lot about this clinically, I suppose, but maybe it would be good to say that, anxiety, at least as a kind of a, as maybe something concise here, because I want to think about what you're asking, is that anxiety can also go two ways, right? Anxiety can, if left untended, unanalyzed, right, it could also, become panic, fear, xenophobia, racism, sectarianism, this kind of affect, right, that has nowhere to go, right, besides being directed in a certain way at an object that is a stand-in object in a certain sense. And it could be a chance, if one is able to sit with it, which, I mean, the inconsistency, the uncertainties which actually define our the places we're both in, if not the whole world at the moment, right? To be able to sit in them and not simply reach for, how does one say, quick solutions, but also ask how one is implicated in the very process that they are anxious about, or how one is able to separate themselves, begin to make a place that is a place for the subject outside the processes which constitute them in these conditions of anxiety and uncertainty.
Sure. Okay.